Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on cool cities. My name is Sierra Killian, and I'm a research associate here at the Environmental Law Institute. We are delighted to welcome everyone to this ELI seminar co-sponsored by the American Bar Association's section on civil rights and social justice. I encourage you to follow the events page on our website, eli.org, for future programs. First, thanks to our outstanding panelists and moderator for joining us today to lend their expertise to this program. Their full speaker bios are available on this webinar's event page on our website, eli.org. At the conclusion of today's panel presentations, we have time for a question and answer session. So please ask these leading experts your questions. You can submit your questions through GoToWebinar's question box. Please don't wait until the end to submit your questions. You can submit them as you think of them. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's panelists and moderator. Surili S. Patel is the Deputy Director for the Center for Public Health Policy at the American Public Health Association. In that role, Surili leads the organization's most notable programs, including those on climate change, water safety and security, children's environmental health, tribal health, environmental health messaging, transportation and healthy community design. Surili has led the charge to establish APHA's new Center on Climate, Health, and Equity, aiming to inspire action on climate and health, advance policy, and galvanize the field to address climate change. Sean Hecht is the co-executive director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment and Evan Frankel Professor of Policy and Practice at UCLA School of Law. He teaches and mentors students and works with students to serve environmental advocacy organizations and public agencies in his role as co-director of the Frank G. Wells Environmental Law Clinic. Sean also conducts research on environmental law and policy issues. Catherine Goldman is a climate policy advisor in the Los Angeles Mayor's Office of Sustainability. She brings to the role extensive experience in climate change policy, ranging from mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions to land use planning and local climate adaptation. When Katie first joined the mayor's office, she coordinated Los Angeles's engagement in the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group as city advisor to Los Angeles. Since moving to Los Angeles in 2006, she has been an independent consultant and has worked for the nonprofit organizations Climate Action Reserve, Climate Resolve, and the Greenhouse Gas Institute, and she has also been an instructor for UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Mark Hartman is Phoenix's Chief Sustainability Officer, charged to support Phoenix's continual efforts to become a global leader in sustainability. Mark formerly worked at the City of Vancouver for 8 years in sustainability, leading their carbon neutral building strategy and their green building code, as well as supporting Vancouver's ambition to become the greenest city in the world by 2020. Mark holds an MBA from Heriot-Watt University and is a LEED accredited professional. And finally, Cynthia R. Harris, the moderator of today's program, is the Director of Tribal Programs and the Deputy Director of the Center for State, Tribal, and Local Environmental Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. Her projects at ELI focus on climate change, tribal and indigenous issues, water quality and conservation, product lifecycle management, green infrastructure, and forestry management and conservation.
Thank you, Sierra, and thanks to our audience and our wonderful panel, Surili, Sean, Katie, and Mark. My name is Cynthia Harris here at ELI, and let's talk about cool cities. I mean that literally and figuratively. Literally, you've probably noticed it's getting hot out there. The world is heating up thanks to greenhouse gas emissions, and it's affecting urban areas in particular due to the urban heat island effect, which exacerbates high temperatures compared to the surrounding countryside. Here are some trends. And let's note, it's not just the Sunbelt cities here in the US. Those cities are actually in a better position to adapt. It's cities not accustomed to extreme heat that will be feeling, well, the heat. And this creates enormous public health problems. Heat stroke, exacerbation of existing conditions, and extreme heat disproportionately impacts certain populations more than others. There's a real disparity. And there are other impacts to our electrical grid, other public infrastructure, and there are economic impacts. So what to do? The obvious answer, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But if you're a municipality, you have to assume you will be affected. And what can you do? Quite a lot. So let's look at what some cities are doing. these are cool cities, figuratively and literally. They're cool because they figured out ways to keep their residents cool. Now, let's turn to our expert panel on this subject. We'll begin with Cerili, who brings a real public health and equity lens to these issues of extreme heat. Thank you for being here, Cerili.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Cynthia and ELI, for the wonderful invitation. I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the intersection between climate change, public health, and health equity. Great. So there are many, many health consequences to climate change. And it really depends on the region. If you're in the Gulf area, you experience more of those pesky hurricanes. If you are in the West, you may experience wildfires, and all of those, in addition to experiencing and living through them, you also feel the health impacts, whether it's injury from the actual flooding of a hurricane, or maybe mold that then builds in your house because of the flooding, or the flames from the wildfires, having that plume stay above you. You breathe it in and causes more respiratory illness in the area. The one health impact that's felt across the country, unfortunately, is heat. Everyone is feeling it. Everyone is feeling it more intense for longer periods of time, and we're seeing heat rise also on the map. So we're seeing northern states also feel the impacts of heat and are struggling to adapt to it. And heat itself has many direct health impacts, like heat stroke, diarrheal diseases, dehydration, and then it has secondary impacts to your health. So for those who already have pre-existing respiratory conditions, it worsens them, allergies, etc. It also impacts cardiovascular disease. It exacerbates it, but it also impacts those who already have it. We're seeing a larger uptick in vector-borne diseases. So now new habitats are being created in states and cities where in the past these vectors couldn't survive. So for example, mosquitoes are migrating more into the north, and they may be carrying diseases like Zika virus. And then we also are seeing vampire bats that are typically indigenous to the Florida region. We're finding them in North and South Carolina. So they're becoming more inhabitable in different places. And in addition to having high heat days, we're also seeing the impact of longer heat seasons. So summers are becoming longer and becoming more intense, which then also means that allergies and asthma are becoming more intense, and it affects the whole range of the age spectrum as well. But let's talk about the moral challenge. As it says on the slide, climate change poses an unacceptably high and potentially catastrophic risk to public health. What I often say is that climate change is blind. It doesn't know our race, income, equality. It doesn't know about our zip code. It's going to impact us all at some point in our lives. What I wish I could say a little less often is some communities are more resilient than others. And what makes those communities resilient is the resources they have to deploy immediately after an event, in the intermediate, and then in the long term. And heat is also one of those where there are short and long-term impacts. So I'm talking about deploying resources, after the GoFundMe sites have been fulfilled, after the camera crews have left. There is still a lot of recovery in terms of the physical community, but also in terms of health. And what's fascinating here is that more and more people in the United States are moving into urban settings or right outside of urban settings. So we're seeing a lot more population density, which is then also contributing to the climate issue. So there's tons of faces of inequality, and I'm going to walk us through a few of them. And Cynthia, listed a few on her slides. This is what I like to call the young, the old, the poor, and the different. With young children, heat impacts them differently than they do adults because they're smaller. They take in more air and water per body unit than adults do. They also have developing organs and immunity systems, and they're highly, highly susceptible to heat-related illnesses like diarrheal disease or dehydration. On the other end of the spectrum are the elderly. They are certainly susceptible to a lot of issues because of their aging systems, their biology. They may come with pre-existing chronic diseases and conditions. And sometimes elderly also have limited mobility, which is an issue in terms of escaping or evacuating in a climate event. Then comes communities of color. So the uncomfortable thing to talk about is the institutionalized racism that they are faced with often, that are compounded when being faced with health challenges related to climate change. There's also a lack of social capital in many communities, as well as sometimes a language barrier. And then we talk about low-income communities. So all these folks could potentially live in a low-income community, and they are faced with less resources. So that means they have less potential to evacuate if needed, but also to seek resources like a cooling center or air conditioning for that matter. There's sometimes inadequate infrastructure in communities due to physical damage. And there may be water and food insecurity as well as psychosocial imbalances. And because we're talking about heat, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the tons of other special populations that are climate sensitive when it comes to heat. And they include outdoor workers, but also indoor workers who may work in conditions where air conditioning is not available or proper ventilation isn't available. Student athletes are certainly a group of concern, as well as rural native populations and indigenous populations. The disabled and the folks without air conditioning, and I'm not just talking about the folks who can't afford air conditioning, which is important, but we're seeing high heat days occurring in the north, and some residents in the northern states don't have air conditioning because they've never needed it before. And then I would be, just to drill it home, of course, the folks with pre-existing medical conditions and health conditions, these heat waves could compound whatever medical history they may have already, and then of course the homeless population as well. So, health equity, just to dive into this, why can't we solve these health problems caused by climate change by going to the doctor or taking a prescription? Well, that's because only 20% of our ability to attain good health comes from medical care. The other 80% comes from what's around us. So it's our equal access to education. It's our ability to have a safe and healthy work condition. Our ability to attain a living wage, our income, our access to transportation and quality food and water that's safe and nutritious. Also, decent living conditions play a huge role in this, housing. And I need to mention community safety plays a big role in our ability to achieve health by way of ensuring people's physical safety, but also their integrity. And then, of course, our outdoor environments play a huge role. So let's call it what it is. Climate change is a human and civil rights issue. It's kind of easy to see it now that it's laid out, but I also feel that if we mindfully approach the problem, I think we can mindfully approach a solution. It's a matter of building the social, political, financial will to do it. And since I am coming from a public health background, I like to think of solutions in terms of an equity framework. The first is procedural that I'll talk about, and this encompasses the fairness to engage in the political process or the decision-making process. So, for example, tree canopy. The communities or the neighborhoods that need tree canopy the most, are they involved in the process of determining whether they would want it and where they would want it or where they see the best use of it. Distributive equity talks more about not just distributing the benefits of an intervention or strategy, but also the burden. So when we go into communities and neighborhoods and we are seeing an opportunity to create more green spaces or plant more trees or create smart surfaces that are cool and green, are we inadvertently driving up the real estate in that neighborhood? What does that mean in terms of the burden? Can folks who used to live there or have businesses there still afford to be there? So that burden should also be considered. And then there's contextual equity, which really recognizes the fact that there is the playing field is never leveled, and it never will be. But in order for people to have the ability to access power and resources, they have to be at the table, and they have to be the ones to determine their own distributive equities. So now I want to pivot to a framework that the public health space has been using for a couple years now. Established back in 2009, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention stood up the Climate and Health Program, which has created a 5-step Building Resilience Against Climate Effects program, or BRACE, as we so affectionately call it. The first step in the process focuses on identifying the scope of climate impacts associated with the potential health outcomes and populations and locations that are vulnerable to the climate impacts. The second phase quantifies the additional burden of health outcomes associated with climate change. Then it looks into identifying the most suitable health interventions for the identification of health impacts of the greatest concern. So what is the biggest challenge that we need to fix first? And then the fourth is to develop an adaptation plan. And the fifth is to look at the process as a whole to evaluate what gaps were missed in terms of steps 1 through 4 and where things can be improved. Previously, this infographic that CDC put out was in a circle because it's ever going. Once you create an adaptation plan, it's not the end of it. There's still more to adapt to. There's still more challenges and maybe new vulnerabilities or disease burdens that come up, and it's often really important to keep circling back to those. Today, CDC has a climate ready states and cities program, and they are funding 16 states and cities at the moment to focus on adaptation planning in their communities. And just reviewing the work of the grantees, I see a common thread, and that's heat. Everyone is looking at heat. Everyone is trying to prioritize how do we adapt to heat, because this is a national scale problem, although the communities that they're serving are different. So generally, when it comes to public health interventions, we often talk in terms of standing up warning systems, setting up cooling centers, providing easy access to public drinking fountains or swimming pools, but all entwined with communications, education, and outreach to communities that need it most. So I have a few examples I'd love to walk us through that really talk about the co-benefits of some of these climate change adaptation strategies. A common measure that state and local public health departments take is around cooling, through tree canopies, and they often work with city planners to see how to effectively plant trees in the right places. And just tree canopies in general allow for a lot of public health co-benefits, and they include more people just being outside, enjoying the weather, enjoying being outdoors, so they get exposed to vitamin D. They have access to exercise through walking, rolling, biking. And then it builds social cohesion, which is often overlooked. Having that community perspective is really key when it comes to mental wellness and maintaining a level of mental wellness in a community as a whole. And also, reduces vehicular traffic. If you don't have to drive a block because it's so hot, people will walk if it's safe and conducive to walking. And that will obviously drive down air pollution, which is linked to so many health conditions that you all know about. And so there's a lot of co-benefits to the tree canopy approach. Another one, which is a little bit more expensive but worth exploring, is the creation of cool surfaces, green surfaces. There's been studies done that in cities, if you look at them very closely, there are dark pockets where it's just not porous, not reflective, and as a result, is driving down the overall city or driving up the overall city heat. And if you look at those neighborhoods, those are often the same neighborhoods that are low income. So the idea is if you were to build, cooling measures like pavements and roofs and other surfaces in these neighborhoods, then you could bring up the temperature for the entire city overall. And then, of course, I mentioned cooling centers, but what's most important to speak to here is the development of heat alert systems and really reaching out to those vulnerable populations that don't necessarily receive their news about this information through our traditional channels, like the newspaper or the televised news or social media. Maybe it's a language barrier, maybe it's a result of not reading, not having the ability to read, or not turning on the radio as often as most do. So it's different types of interventions that include identifying those groups of vulnerable populations and reaching out to them in a more intentional way. And Minnesota has done just that. Apparently, Minnesota is the third fastest warming state in the country, and yet a lot of the residents aren't equipped to necessarily handle these heat waves because many of them don't have air conditioning. So what the state Department of Health has done is created an extreme heat toolkit that responds to heat events, and it includes steps such as allocating resources to those that are most vulnerable. Now, this toolkit, since it's been created, has been adapted by several local health departments to figure out where and how to reach vulnerable communities or individuals in communities by working through local organizations. And another example is in San Francisco. According to some climate modeling, San Francisco will experience 40 extreme heat days annually by 2050. That means those are the days where you're advised to not be outside unless you absolutely have to. And this impacts livelihood, this impacts ability to go to doctor's visits, go to school, etc. It really does impact our ability to be outside. And interestingly enough, they're projecting that by 2100, San Francisco will see upward of 100 or more extreme heat days. So they need to do something. The first thing that they've done is created this heat vulnerability index, where the city has uncovered that the neighborhoods that already suffer from the high heat days the most are also the ones that are most are also the low income neighborhoods. And so now the index is being used to guide where to designate cooling centers and other types of interventions that the community has agreed upon, as well as conducting specific education and outreach to those individuals in those communities. So, just like these BRACE grantees, I think there's a huge opportunity with this big challenge, which is, the ability to shape climate policy, to promote action and engagement so that every community has the ability to become resilient and not just go back to baseline, but really become resilient so they're prepared in the future for the next climate event, because there will be another climate event. The world as we know it is certainly changing for hotter, and someone really inspiring reminded me that things move at the speed of trust, and that what we do is intellectualize a lot of things that are deeply emotional and deeply human. And climate change is that. It's deeply human and deeply emotional. And that's why it's important to protect those that are most vulnerable from the heat effects of climate change. But it's even more important to make sure that we do it in unison with the communities that are being served. Because this is, as we say in public health, the biggest threat to our health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Surili. These are really important considerations. It ties into our next presenter, Sean Hecht from the Emmett Institute, who will be talking about taking it to that next level of governance. Thank you for joining us today, Sean.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this. So just to start with, my background includes assisting communities with sea level rise planning in particular, and it's been a very interesting few years here in California, both from the perspective of sea level rise planning and wildfire planning and other kinds of risks like health risks, as Surili was talking about. I was most recently on the team that developed the Los Angeles County Sustainability Plan. There was a group of us from UCLA who participated in the team of folks who helped the county sustainability office to develop it. And so I'm going to share some of the lessons from my work on this and a few other observations. So traditionally, local government does a lot of different types of planning, and that planning is really integrated into the governance structure of local government. So here in California, every local government, every city and county has to have a land use plan and more generally a general plan that has a bunch of different elements within it. And those types of plans are very, they're integrated into the fabric of local governments. And so this is just a few of the types of plans that we see: land use plans, hazard mitigation plans, housing community development plans, economic development plans, and community health plans. And these are designed to direct the work of agencies and to provide a blueprint for the agencies within a local government to do the type of work that they do in a way that contributes to the goals of the local government over time. These typically might span a 5-year or in some cases even an indefinite framework of time. Here in California, for example, our general plans are supposed to be updated at least every decade, and many of them have historically gotten outdated as conditions have changed around us. But one of the main features of these plans is that they feed into the work that is done through building codes and zoning codes and other local government ordinances that help to operationalize the planning that's embodied in these documents. And they're usually pretty well defined in terms of which agencies within the local government are responsible for doing the work that is contemplated by the planning, whether that's a city planning department or a public health agency or whatever other agency is tasked with it. So we now have an emerging type of planning that we can call sustainability planning overall, which really has changed the way that local governments start to think about these issues. And these types of plans tend to be more cross-cutting, in contrast to the kind of planning that Surili was talking about just now. And examples of these in California include climate action plans and adaptation and resilience plans that local governments embark on. These types of plans cover a range of issues that cross-cut multiple departments within a local government. So they involve both the supply and the demand for energy. They include transportation networks. They include public health considerations in some cases. These two types of plans that I mentioned here are quite different from each other because a climate action plan typically refers to a plan whose goal is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from a local government within that local government's jurisdiction, while an adaptation plan typically refers to a plan for addressing the impacts of climate change in some way. And of course, there are all kinds of public health impacts that are exacerbated by climate change, as Surili mentioned, not necessarily caused by climate change so much as exacerbated from whatever the baseline is. And so when we think about adaptation planning, we're often thinking about building on the resilience that communities already should have built in and planning for a future where the conditions are somewhat changed. The climate action planning and adaptation planning are characterized by having a pretty structured process. And the BRACE planning that Surly was talking about is an example of a kind of adaptation plan with a very structured process. With climate action planning, typically we start with a greenhouse gas inventory that's designed to figure out what the emissions are within a jurisdiction, and then to develop goals, strategies, and actions for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions within that jurisdiction over time. Adaptation planning starts typically with a vulnerability assessment that ultimately will look at the risks that a community faces, including the social determinants of risk, as Surly was talking about, and ultimately comes out with a climate adaptation plan. Here in California, adaptation planning has focused very much around coastal adaptation to future sea level rise, as well as wildfire adaptation planning. And of course, because the wildfire events in particular are unpredictable, in the last several fire seasons, we have had fires that have really outstripped the ability of communities to successfully plan for them. This type of planning clearly is iterative, and we learn over time from the experiences that communities have about what a good adaptation planning process really looks like and what kinds of steps need to be taken. And so this means that some of the early adopters of these plans, while they get a lot of credit for being early adopters, in a way their plans may already be outdated, and they have to be thinking about how they might update that planning. But both of these planning processes do have in common that they typically cut across different agencies. We also have state-level planning, and these are just some examples of the kind of state-level planning that we're doing here in California, planning for sea level rise in our built environment, planning for adaptation more generally, including especially wildfire planning. And these strategies tend to be aimed at guiding local governments above all else, because it is true that local governments have so much authority over both the built environment and transportation and public health that at the state level, it's harder to do effective planning. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that many of these challenges cross across jurisdictions. And so a particular jurisdiction might be limited in the scale to which it can respond to some of these challenges. And so that dynamic where both the solutions have to come at the local level, but the local jurisdictions are not equipped scale-wise to address the scope of the problem, creates some particular challenges that in some cases require regional coordination as an intermediate step between state-level planning and local government planning. So we do have new types of planning efforts that have emerged in the last several years. And these types of plans really do something somewhat different than the other types of plans that I've been discussing. So these plans might address, for example, economic development and environment and equity all together, rather than focusing on a particular aspect of public health or the environment. They require integrated approaches that not only cut across departmental boundaries in the way that climate action planning does, but that truly require the engagement of agencies that might never have seen themselves as being involved in sustainability efforts or climate adaptation efforts or public health efforts. These types of efforts also often really rely on public and stakeholder participation, and this is related to what Surly referred to as procedural equity, the idea that public participation enables communities to help to design these types of plans in a way that make the plans more effective over time and serve those communities better. These plans really focus to a large extent on the social determinants of health in a way that a simple climate action plan or even a very complex climate adaptation plan might not focus on. And so the emphasis in plans like this might very much be on who is going to benefit over time, who is going to be vulnerable to these risks over time, and how can we address those types of vulnerabilities and also spread benefits out. One really key question is what the metrics for success are of a plan like this. A plan like a climate action plan where you have a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a set amount has a measurable baseline and a measurable impact over time. And so it might be relatively straightforward to determine whether that plan has been successful simply by measuring emissions. Adaptation and resilience planning is more complex than that in terms of developing metrics and targets to try to determine whether this plan has actually been effective. And the types of plans that I'm talking about here that address equity and economic development together with environmental issues are even more complicated to develop targets and metrics for. How do you define what success is in a program like this? And so that challenge is one that local governments are facing all the time as they try to develop these more cross-cutting and complex plans. So there are some other challenges with cross-cutting planning efforts. Stakeholder engagement is complex, it's expensive, it requires getting people on the ground to, for example, hold workshops and do other things that get into communities to get their input. The structure of decision-making might not be clear. It's quite clear in most jurisdictions how you do land use planning and how you do public health planning with respect to the duties of particular agencies. But if you have a planning effort that cuts across environment and equity and economic development and cuts across all departments within a local jurisdiction, the decision-making structures both for the planning effort and the implementation might be quite less clear. And in particular, the planning offices might not have any authority over some of the key processes that need to happen in order for the plan to be implemented. And so we may have, in many jurisdictions now, there are new sustainability offices that are being developed. Those sustainability offices may have very little power over budgetary decisions, very little power over the implementation in any particular department, and typically few human resources at their own disposal. They are really developing plans that are designed to be implemented across a number of departments and agencies that then have to buy into the planning in order for the planning to be successful. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Los Angeles County's Our County Plan, which was released just a couple of months ago by Los Angeles County. The county, a couple of years ago, created a new chief sustainability office, and that sustainability office was charged with creating this plan and doing other efforts to improve sustainability outcomes in Los Angeles County. The county had a contractor, the firm Burrow Happold, on a team with various other entities, including a bunch of us here at UCLA, assist with the development of the plan. This plan is really unusual. As you can see from this slide, the plan articulates cross-cutting goals rather than being organized around specific topic or departmental areas. So there's no section of the plan that's the section about water supply or the section about heat. Instead, there are cross-cutting goals that articulate more of a vision about what a sustainable Los Angeles County might look like. And those cross-cutting goals are then linked to particular tags to initiatives and departments. Of course, this creates a number of challenges, some of which I've already mentioned, overlapping jurisdictions between agencies and complexity in implementation. But what it does is it allows the county to articulate a stronger vision of what it wants to be 20 years down the line. A county level plan also faces some more specific challenges, including the fact that, at least in California, counties typically house a number of different cities or municipalities, and the counties and the cities have different and in some cases overlapping jurisdiction. And so, for example, land use decisions within the city of Los Angeles are not made by the county of Los Angeles, although the county does make decisions that might influence that, including decisions about transportation networks and decisions that relate to the county Department of Public Health. But that overlapping nature of the jurisdiction makes a more complex process, and we're going to hear later in this webinar about the City of Los Angeles' own sustainability planning. So here's the organization of the Our County document. There are goals, which are really broad aspirational statements of what the county wants to achieve. There were strategies that were articulated about how to achieve those goals, and then specific policies to support the strategies. The key part of this document, and really the key part of any planning document, is to have targets that you're trying to meet, particular outcomes that you want, and then quantitative measures that are used to understand the progress that you're making. And so I'm going to make that a little bit more concrete in the next couple of slides. So this is the strategy involving integrating climate resilience and adaptation into planning, buildings, infrastructure, and community development. I hope that this slide is readable, but basically the idea behind this strategy is to say anything that the LA County has control over in its infrastructure should be developed in a way that integrates climate resilience. There's a little bit of narrative explaining in particular some of the inequities that result from climate change, and then there are targets that are built into this. And so we have two types of targets for this strategy. One of the targets involves reducing heat trapping surfaces to create cooler green surfaces. So this could be increasing tree canopy. It could be using cooler materials or more reflective materials for infrastructure like pavement. And so you'll see on the slide that there are 3 target dates by which particular percentages of these surfaces will be changed, so that ultimately, rather than having a county that is 90% or so concrete and asphalt and heat trapping, that 30% of that will be converted to cooler green surfaces. Now you'll see on the slide that one of the challenges with this target is that we don't fully understand what the baseline is. We don't fully know exactly how much of LA County's land area is being covered by heat trapping surfaces today. So part of the work to implement this will be simply to figure out what the baseline is before the work even starts. And that's an illustration of how complicated it is sometimes to build in these types of targets. You'll see that there's a second target here, which involves looking at health outcomes as they are reflected in emergency room visits. And so this is one that's much easier to count. There's a countable number of emergency room visits per 100,000 residents. And the goal is to reduce this significantly by 2035 and then by 2045. These two goals interrelate with each other, of course. The first goal, the one about heat trapping surfaces, the outcomes are only indirectly related to the targets, but that type of conversion of surfaces is absolutely crucial. The second target, the one related to emergency room visits, is very measurable, and it reflects impacts on people's real lives, but of course it's also only part of the picture because there are many health outcomes that don't result in emergency visits that are still negative. So this is an example of how the county articulates some of the actions under its plan. So this action is an action that's in furtherance of the targets that we just saw on the previous slide. The county is going to develop a heat island mitigation strategy that addresses cool pavements and roofs, pavement reduction, and urban greening. And so this is the set of actions that will result in the reduction of heat trapping surfaces and conversion into cooler green surfaces. And you can see that that the lead entity here is the County Department of Public Health. This is but at the same time, this is going to require the county's Department of Public Works and various other county agencies to participate in order to be successful. And so this will require quite a bit of coordination among county agencies. So going forward, there's a lot of questions about how this will be implemented, how effective it will be, how we can ensure equity concerns are integrated into governance, and how we're going to evaluate success of these programs. I will say I was very impressed with the commitment that LA County had, and I'm also very impressed with the related commitment that LA City has made on these fronts. It's definitely innovative, and it's in a way really a test case for other communities to see if they can develop these types of cross-cutting plans. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean, for really breaking down the process and the considerations local governments can and should take into account. Now we'll turn to two cool cities, specifically LA and Phoenix. For LA, we have Katie, who will tell us a bit about what the City of Angels is doing to address extreme heat. Thank you so much, Katie.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the speakers that came before me for setting the stage beautifully for a conversation about what's happening here in Los Angeles at the city level. And Sean gave you a great sort of intro to the LA County. And just to give you some perspective, the greater metropolitan area of Los Angeles is pretty big. We have about 18 million people living here in the greater metropolitan area and about 4 million people in the city of LA proper. It is the third largest metropolitan economy in the world, and a very diverse and exciting place to be, and I hope you get a chance to visit sometime. Oh, let me back up. So things are changing here in Los Angeles. We feel it already. We have hot days. It's getting hotter. We have wildfires. We have drought. We're dealing with intense rain events, as well as sort of layered on top of that, a housing crisis and an increasing population of homeless in Los Angeles. So our vulnerable communities are changing. We do have some data in LA about what we think the future climate will be, and what I'm showing you here is a study from Los Angeles. It's regional modeling of future temperature, future climate in Los Angeles, scaled down to the local level. And this is actually showing you projected temperature change at the neighborhood council level. We have about 99 neighborhood councils in the city of Los Angeles. And so, you know, we could spend a lot of time digging into this, but I think the take-home point is it's definitely getting warmer in Los Angeles, but there is variation on where and how hot it will be. And so we know that with this data. We have other data resources. We do have a heat vulnerability index, and we have spatial data on vulnerable communities as well. So we have a good understanding of where temperature is going to rise, where we have heat vulnerability, and where we have vulnerable populations in the city. We also understand that we have heat related illnesses and deaths in Los Angeles. And this map here is a study from researchers at UCLA. This is the full county of LA, by the way. It's pretty massive. And this is a study of emergency room visits for heat-related illnesses in LA, in the LA region. And so we have a sense of how many people are going to emergency rooms, who the vulnerable groups are, youth, elderly, people with medical conditions, as we heard from the first speaker. It's basically what you would expect, the themes that we've been hearing already today. We are one of the only cities that has experienced heat-related deaths in the wintertime. So we know this is a problem. We know the climate's changing, and so we have been working hard to plan for extreme heat. And Sean went through various planning approaches, and what I'm showing you here are 3 of our planning documents. They work together, they're integrated together to sort of build our strategy for extreme heat. The first one on your left is the original Sustainable City Plan. It's a sustainability plan, the first one ever published for the city of Los Angeles in 2015. And it has a chapter on resilience and preparedness. Then in 2018, our Office of Resilience, so I work in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. We also have an Office of Resilience in the Mayor's Office of Public Safety. That group, with our collaboration, published a document called Resilient LA. It's our strategy for building resilience across Los Angeles. And it was developed with support from 100 resilient cities. Then most recently in April, my team published LA's Green New Deal, which is an update to that original plan from 2015, but it also integrates and builds on the targets and strategies articulated in Resilient LA. And so collectively, these are our documents that we use and we refer to for planning for extreme heat. We also have a general plan update being undertaken. We have a local hazard mitigation plan that looks at climate risks and heat. So those other sorts of planning documents we have as well, but these are our sustainability and adaptation strategy documents. And this is really just a picking out a selection of just a few of the high-level targets in that report, in those reports. At the top, you see our overarching strategy articulated in Resilient LA, that we in LA want to have strong and connected neighborhoods. We have a goal to prepare and protect those most vulnerable to increasing extreme heat. So it's a clearly articulated high-level policy and objective that we're aligning our programming around for Los Angeles. The next two targets you see that are yellow come out of the Green New Deal, our document that was just released in April. And those articulate particular targets, metrics, measurable outcomes that we are intending to achieve. The first is to reduce the urban-rural temperature differential by at least 1.7 degrees by 2025 and 3 degrees by 2035. And this is a metric that researchers have suggested is a way to monitor the actual urban heat island effect in cities. So high-level target is to reduce the warming, the way the city feels in terms of temperature. Another target that I've pulled out is related to tree canopy. Tree canopy and trees, and I'll get into this in a minute, is one of the strategies we're using to address heat. This target is to increase tree canopy in areas of greatest need by at least 50% by 2028 to grow a more equitable urban forest that provides cooling, public health, habitat, energy savings, and other benefits. The point here is we do have goals to increase our tree canopy, but they are explicitly intended to enhance shade in areas where we don't have enough shade, in areas of greatest need, so that we do have an equitable distribution of that benefit. I want to spend a little bit of time just showing you some of our cooling strategies. Those are our high-level targets. They are supported by on-the-ground initiatives, on-the-ground strategies. And so I want to show you a little bit about what we're doing on the ground here in Los Angeles and talk about how we've moved from individual strategies, trees, cool roofs, cool pavements, we're moving towards getting a more integrated set of measures that really focus on neighborhood cooling strategies. So just gonna tell you a little bit about our cool roof requirements and rebates in the city of LA. So we have goals. I didn't show them to you in that other target slide, but we do have targets to increase the number of cool roofs in the city of LA. And we're doing this through an ordinance that's been in effect actually since 2014 that requires all new roofs and all roof replacements to be on residential buildings to be cool roofs. So this has been in effect for a number of years now, and at this point we estimate about 28,000 cool roofs on residential buildings in Los Angeles. Now this ordinance was put in place at the same time a package of rebates was provided through our Department of Water and Power to help promote and mitigate the slightly higher cost of cool roofs, at least at that point in time. Those rebates are still in effect. So homeowners in Los Angeles who are replacing their roofs with cool roofing can get a rebate of 30 cents, up to 30 cents per square foot for their cool roofs from our Department of Water and Power. So we have a combination of requirements and incentives to help roll out this needed measure in the city of LA. In addition, we are working on updating our cool roof ordinance to both expand the performance requirements of cool roofs, as well as the types of buildings covered, and to sort of build off of some of what Sean was saying about the county and having a county-wide framework. We're really working to bring our new cool roof ordinance into alignment with an ordinance adopted by the county last year for cool roofs. So we work together. If the county passes something that's broader, more ambitious, then of course we work to get into alignment with that. And so the cool roofs is a good example of how the county and the city working together can move quite a lot forward. We also have been exploring the use of cool pavements in the city of Los Angeles. Starting in 2015, we piloted our Bureau of Street Safety piloted our first installment of cool pavement at a facility in the San Fernando Valley called the Balboa Sports Complex. It was really just an opportunity to use the material. It's a new technology, it's a new material, to get experience using it, and then to get some sort of initial preliminary feedback on the product itself. That went well, and so the city obtained additional funding to install cool pavements. And you can see it's a lighter colored slurry that gets coated on top of the existing asphalt. And we've received funding to install this on one city block in each of 15 council districts. So I mentioned earlier we have, each of 15 council districts. And so this gave the Bureau more opportunity to figure out how to work with the material, but also more opportunity to do some testing, to talk to communities, to see how they feel about this new surface, and to look at how it wears and tears, basically. And it was spread out across our 15 council districts so it was equally distributed. So we learned quite a bit about these pilot tests. We learned that the temperature does go down over a cool surface by about 10 degrees. Residents were generally optimistic, excited about the installations. It got a lot of press coverage. There's real interest in this technology, and other cities have also reached out to learn more about it. There are some concerns about staining and darkening over time. That light surface can get dirty and worn pretty quickly, but we're really at the beginning of this technology, so there are new formulations and new products being developed and tested still to date. So I would say that the results of the pilot testing are pretty positive. So with that in mind, the Bureau of Street Services has continued to build out its cool pavement program. They've tried out some new colorful coatings of cool pavement on protected bike lanes. They're working on neighborhood level cool pavement projects. So doing more with neighborhoods to install cool pavements beyond the 15 council districts that I mentioned. But in conjunction with this, there's really a building awareness and understanding that we need to understand the human health and comfort effects of cool pavements. So while we know they will reduce temperature, they're also a reflective surface. And so how does somebody standing next to a road covered with cool pavement actually experience their environment? And so our Bureau of Street Services is doing a lot of measurement to understand that better. And then they're integrating all of this knowledge into working on multi-benefit projects that incorporate a number of strategies. So not just cool pavements, but cool pavements, green bike lanes, shade trees, bioswales, shaded bus shelters, and hydration stations. So we're taking these tools in our toolbox and beginning to work with communities to build out cool neighborhoods. And I'll go on and tell you a little bit about one of those projects in a second, but I do want to mention that in our sustainability plan, in the Green New Deal plan, we do have targets for hydration stations, and our Department of Water and Power recently installed 20 temporary hydration stations outside in communities where there are homeless, so that we have increased their access to drinking water. And so we have multiple projects moving in conjunction and being integrated into these multi-benefit projects. And so, I want to just touch on our urban tree canopy program. So we in LA have had a challenged tree canopy. Our tree health has experienced disease. Our trees have experienced disease, limited funding. So we do have a street trees in sort of poor condition, to be frank, in Los Angeles, but we're working on that. And so recently we've increased funding by 30%, or resources by 30% to improve our urban tree health. We just recently, within the last month, hired a chief urban forester. So this is a person whose job it is to coordinate on tree policy across the city of LA, because as you can imagine, the Bureau of Street Services plants street trees, and Parks and Rec manages trees in parks, and we have other groups also working on tree planting on public and private lands. And so we have one person now coordinating on tree policy and tree health for the city of LA. As I mentioned, we have our tree canopy goals, which are equity focused, and we are developing a more comprehensive tree inventory for the city of Los Angeles to improve our data on our trees so that we can better manage them. So we are investing in our urban tree program here in LA, recognizing the importance of tree canopy for providing shade. And I think I hit most of these points, so I'm gonna skip past that one and tell you a little bit about a program, a newly implemented program in Los Angeles, the Canoga Park Sherman Way Station Cooling Project, which was made possible by a planning grant from SB1, an SB1 adaptation planning grant, which is a statewide grant for adaptation planning received by the city of LA to work in a disadvantaged community to get community input and develop a heat mitigation or cooling project around a bus stop in the San Fernando Valley. This is a high heat vulnerability area that's high pedestrian. It's an important transit point in the city of LA. And basically what you see here are the results of that process, a couple renderings of the envisioned cooling project in this community as an outcome of the SB1 grants. And so I think I'm going to wrap it up there and just leave you with a few resources, and happy to answer any questions you might have about how we're doing here in Los Angeles, what are some of the lessons we've learned with implementing these cooling strategies. And I'll hand it over to our next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie. Many challenges, but also many opportunities. And I'll take a moment to quickly encourage our audience and participants to submit your questions online, because we know you do have them. We'll turn now to Mark Hartman in Phoenix, a city that definitely has experience with extreme heat. I think the last time I went there, it was a balmy 114 degrees or so outside. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mark.
Yes, hello and welcome. Certainly, speaking to you from a city that's known for heat, and actually the residents here, the same way that we look for like desert adapted trees and things, that people here are somewhat desert adapted, where it's part of our DNA. People here, they don't identify as Phoenix as much as they say they live in a desert. They recognize that, and that basically adversity has its own gifts. It really lets people know and think about it. So for many people here, it's just part of the lifestyle of being here. And it, as far as a city, it's where this has been very much a topic of conversation for, the last decade of what to do about heat. That for Phoenix, it's been a long time conversation. And so we've done quite a potpourri of actions. But I must admit, we really haven't had a comprehensive overall look at how to work together. So all departments are doing many things. Builders, developers have many actions they do just naturally. However, really looking forward to that. I'll kind of talk about what some of those things are. And I think it's really important. I appreciate this conversation today because cities are kind of rehearsing our future. And the future ain't what it used to be. So it's going to get hotter. So let's look at that. And I think the most important context and way to think about heat is that and how I described it is it's actually like a silent storm that, other types of storms, people are very aware, but for heat, people just don't recognize it the same way. It's silent, and yet if there's more deaths related to heat than all other natural disasters or weather-related disasters combined. So really interesting to think about heat that way. That's very important and requires attention. And so as kind of introduced, summer heat in Phoenix, that certainly 21 degrees hotter than in rural areas. And this is typically in the early evening hours when the city has not really cooled down at all, while the urban rural areas have cooled down. And so very important to recognize that. And even just in general, they're 3 degrees hotter than a city than in the surrounding more rural communities. And, although the people are very much adapted, that heat doesn't affect all people the same. And I think the last few speakers have really outlined that it's those outdoor workers and the people experiencing homelessness and others who are just more exposed to, the zero-car households that need to walk through that 114 degrees you just heard about to the bus stops and wait at the bus stops. So some really important things of how do we do that and how do we prepare our community. And so certainly like all the cities, a tree and shade master plan for us, it's to double our tree and shade canopy and by 2030. So in other words, go to 25% canopy from the current about 13%. And there are many examples, but it's interesting is one of the things a comprehensive plan has looked is just saying, look, everyone says, oh, look, we got all the shading everywhere. Look at all the shading we have. It's over the buildings and sidewalks. But as we met with businesses a couple months ago and said, what is it we can do to encourage more of you to put shade in front of your businesses? Because we realized that people here will walk across the street in order to walk in the shade. Like, how do we encourage business to do that? And they said, it is crazy how cities make it extremely difficult for them to put shade over the sidewalk, that require revocable permits and variances and go to hearings and all these things in order for them to just put a shade canopy in front of their business. And so we really are now looking and going back to our planning department and saying, how can we make it where it's actually an incentive and make it easy for people to actually install shade, make that to be the standard and make it really simple to do that. So it's really interesting that in many ways we're doing lots of things, but there's also lots of ways to improve that. And one of the most recent ways we've brought forward is actually something that I think is pretty innovative. It's called the Walkable Urban Code. And so realizing that a lot of new development happening, we're one of the fastest growing cities in the US and the 5th largest, so a lot of new development happening, that the Walkable Urban Code actually has requirements in there that actually require 75% shade around new developments. So in other words, really saying, look, if we really want any new development in these high growth areas needs to create this shade corridor all around the buildings to actually encourage people and allow people to kind of move throughout our city. And certainly as campaigns, you've certainly heard about the hydration stations and things. Well, this is a really big thing for us. There's about 139 organizations committing to our heat relief network, where, even principles from early days of heat planning, and the planning was very much that it's not so much just even necessarily low income or things, it's just people that are really not connected and alone, that really don't have other people checking on them. So very much really try to connect people and actually have, faith-based organizations and others reach out to the community, every year a huge campaign that goes for 3 months long of letting people know about, helping people get to places, the cooling centers that we have kind of throughout our city. And probably the most, significant thing of where we're really wanting to do a really close look of how do we look at this? What's the most important? As we talk to other cities, we actually find they're all looking. There's certainly a lot looking to Phoenix to say, what are you doing? And we have everyone looks at every time the headlines. Oh, Phoenix is hitting these hot temperatures, and what's the plight of this huge desert city? Can it survive? These huge heat. And so there's a great article actually though from the Scientific American, the most widely read scientific magazine in the world. It's kind of said, look, here's some of the things Phoenix is doing and examples of how it's beating some of this urban heat and how it's able to reach out to that. I like this quote actually done by one of the researchers at ASU that it's one of the biggest hurdles, that mitigating heat is a huge hurdle, but it's really whose responsibility is it? Is it the health department? Is it the city? Is it whose job is it to actually make sure our whole city is cool? So the city's very much taking this on because it is a huge concern of residents to recognize that. And so that's really our plan. And so here's what as we're moving ahead, it's kind of an exciting time. We actually just have council approval this spring to first create, as some of the other cities are also looking at this urban heat mitigation adaptation plan, but incorporating many of these ideas that we have that look at policy around implementation and around governance, and then also to pilot a heat ready certification. I don't know if many of you have heard of, there's 2,200 cities in the US that are storm ready. They're certified by the National Weather Service and storm ready. Well, for us, we want to say, okay, what is it to be heat ready from all aspects of both the planning and the implementation side of what it would define of what it is. We have so many researchers, the epicenter of research here for heat. And so really, what are some of the things we can articulate and bring together? So we're working with our university to kind of create that heat ready certification model that other cities in the future could adopt. And one interesting thing that is about, and it's this last item here, this developing a walk shed tool, is we realize that we really actually don't need to shade our entire city, it's really where the pedestrians move, to create cool corridors where people can actually move and traverse around the city and walk or bike and make those pathways. We said to people, if there was a shaded pathway from your home to nearby stores, would you walk more often than you do now? And 92% of people, no surprise, said yes. Actually, they'd love that, to actually have these network of corridors that are connected. And so we looked at some modeling tool originally developed at Harvard that looks at all the census tract information, looks at, certainly things like zero-car households, but other aspects as well of where the bus stops and where the stores are, and say, how do people make their way around the city? What are the highest pedestrian corridors, and where should we prioritize? Where's a walk shed that most people are walking and traversing, and prioritize those areas first to really make sure we do that. And that actually is in a lot of our vulnerable neighborhoods and things where there's actually a high degree of walking. And so we're kind of doing those free actions. It's kind of our new and most exciting things that's happening. So that's a quick snapshot of all the things happening in Phoenix, and looking forward to questions, I guess, to all of us as panelists. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Mark. These are some very practical tips based on Phoenix's experience, and we're really looking forward to seeing those tools and plans roll out. And we're going to turn to our full panel for some Q&A, and I'm going to start out with one because I really want to bring up social isolation, which has been touched on a bit as a barrier to implementing many public health and other interventions like cooling centers. And this really affects certain populations like senior citizens, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness. And we do know the value of things like social networks to reduce mortality rates, like Chicago after the horrific 1995 heat wave. And we see some cities doing things like New York City has a Be a Buddy NYC program. San Francisco has something called Neighbor Fest. What do you see as solutions? And I think we'll start with Surili from the public health perspective, as policies and programs that cities and public health officials can implement to reach these really hard to reach groups?
Sure. It's often a goal to, through the BRACE framework, to really work and identify populations that are most vulnerable to a climate event. And so heat being one, one of the strategies used and deployed is to really look at which populations don't receive information the traditional way, whether it's the news or social media. Sometimes radio advisories are more friendly to certain communities and neighborhoods that often tune into the radio, for example, than others. So it's really identifying the communities, but then how they receive information. And I think I mentioned also earlier the language barrier. So social isolation can also happen because, there's a divide in terms of the information that's provided and the way it's provided. So if it's written or print, making sure it's in multiple languages based on the community's needs, but also at a reading level that they can understand the most. So there's several intervention strategies, and I think almost everyone touched on how to reach those communities.
I'd like to chime in. One unique idea that we had, and it was actually in talking with the community. We often look at what are the what do the PhDs think? Well, a lot of the community members, they have a PhD in their community. Like they understand what it's like to live there, and they really know and understand it. And as we were doing a lot of the engagement with our community, there was a few things that came out, and one was actually that people said it would be great if we could actually, in some of like our grandmother's place, have like temperature monitors that would send us a notice if their place was too hot or things, because sometimes they won't notice. They'll just try to save money and not turn on the air conditioning, and actually their place gets really warm. So we actually piloted an app with that, and we're actually doing 30 different locations, 30 different homes, and having notification to residents. We first started, we're thinking of having it notify the city, but then it would really put the onus on us and our liability with having been notified about this person. So we shifted to family members to do that. And it's kind of an interesting idea to have that connection with their families, to make sure people are aware and be constantly thinking about, what are making sure they're checking on it. And as well, I guess our heat relief network that is, many of the communities have, where they actually do check and knock on doors on places to make sure they have water, and making sure that those people are checked on, because it is the people who are really alone who are the most vulnerable.
This is Katie Goldman from the city of LA. If I just could chime in real quick too, I would say this is really a really important conversation to have, and one potential strategy just to have in the back of the mind is that it might make sense to work through community-based organizations and sort of trusted partners who already have relationships with citizens on the ground, so to speak, and provide materials translated into different languages. And so I would just want to throw out there that leveraging community-based organizations might be a good strategy too.
And these are really good points to meet the community members where they are. And we're going to turn to the audience for some questions who will be brought to us by Sierra.
Yeah, our first question is from Sahana, and she is curious to hear more about the impacts of extreme heat on water management plans in your municipalities. How has water management been affected by increasing heat, and what strategies are being used to plan for that?
I imagine that's directed at one of the two cities, but I'm actually not sure I have a good answer for that. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
Sorry, could you say the question again?
Of course, yes. She's curious to hear more about water management plans and how water management is impacted by increasing heat.
And Actually, for us, yeah, no, actually, a lot of people wonder about Phoenix. So we've been thinking about water for 100 years. A lot of cities, it's kind of a new conversation. But for us, when I actually see things like watering of trees and things like that, of using watering and cooling corridors as the highest and best use of water, like those are really good. We waste, as people, as humans, so much of our water and our water supply. So really thinking about how to just eliminate waste and making sure that we're using our water for those. I mean, Phoenix is pretty unique. I think it's the only city in the whole US that actually recycles 100% of its water. So all of our wastewater actually goes and processes, and it goes to uses that were typically might be potable water, but is in our case is used on golf courses and other irrigation and farms, and as well as at nuclear plant and things. But just trying to use water wisely, and no, very important. But it's I think water's a really important conversation. No, absolutely.
And I'll just add to that. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for going first. I was at a loss, but you really hit on some really important things. Just to add to the sort of cool streets concept and cool neighborhoods, we are looking at bioswales and other green infrastructure that increases our ability to recharge the groundwater, but also has some added cooling effect as well. So that's just maybe a co-benefit or a synergy of water and heat mitigation collectively.
Actually, one thing I was going to mention, I forgot to, was we actually did one of the things that ASU studied was two neighborhoods that were just 2 miles apart. So this was both in the city, just 2 miles away. And one was 13 degrees average surface temperature different than the other. And the one that was cooler actually had a lot of green infrastructure and a lot of shade. And so really interesting, just so close of realizing, oh, we should really, and as neighborhoods hear about it, they say, hey, we want our neighborhood to be 13 degrees cooler. So really important that this is actually a great opportunity we have.
And wow, that really shows the stark differential there. And I'll add just one point is when you're planting your street trees, please make certain that you're using drought-tolerant native species, which may seem obvious, but sometimes not. So it's the little things and the big things that really make a difference. And Katie, you had mentioned putting in additional hydration stations, which I think was addressed as an issue in California by Berkeley Law last year. So that was an excellent point. We do have another audience question, I believe.
Yes, Akili is wondering, how have you responded to communities when they disagree with your local government's plan?
So I'll jump in on that one. I've had a lot of community consultation, and like I said, actually, it's really important to hear the voice of the community, that they actually have much better ideas than we do. So they understand what it's like day to day, and only when we actually do have that conversation. So that's where the ideas need to come from. So when they're coming from those communities, they're also much better received. And I know we actually were in some of the neighborhoods talking about heat, and some of them, we talked about how what to happen when somebody, collapses in the heat, and the community said, yeah, what do you do? We don't actually have that. So we actually kind of incorporated training in communities of how to treat someone who's actually collapsed because of the heat, because they would just lay them on the sidewalk in the sun and not move them over into the shade, just because they go like, oh, they've collapsed. You're not supposed to move them, So the ambulance would arrive, and there they are laying on black concrete or black pavement, and with in the sun, and they've got heat stroke. Like, it's like, okay, no, you should have moved into the shade. So really interesting and important to kind of work with the community together, co-create what those solutions are.
No, those are some excellent points. I'm curious, Sean, you worked with the County of LA, and you've discussed the importance of public engagement. Do you have any other tips on that?
I guess I don't have any great insights into the public engagement process. I mean, it was very robust in that case. They did multiple public workshops, and obviously in a situation like that, you are going to get multiple perspectives. Not everybody's going to agree on everything. And I think, the important thing, or one of the important things, is to make sure that people do have the opportunity for input and feel like their voices have been heard. And ultimately, the plan might not satisfy everybody in every respect. The LA County plan really did get very broad support, and I think part of that is because there was something positive in it for just about every community, and communities were willing maybe to look past smaller ways in which they might have disagreed with certain parts of the plan, because they understood that the net benefit from the plan was very high. But aside from that, I don't have any great ideas about how to do that kind of engagement most effectively, except that in the LA County case, it was very much worth the level of public engagement that they had, because as the other speakers said, a lot of great ideas were brought to the table, and it did garner a lot of support from communities throughout the county.
Terrific. And we have just a couple minutes left, so I'm just going to leave with one final question for each of you. We'll start with Cerulli, I believe. If you could ask the federal government or state government, and I'm asking this because I know we have a broad swath of people participating in this webinar and people who are audience. So here's your chance. If you could ask the federal government or the state government for one thing to support you as a local government, or as a researcher or a public health official, and let's open up to, say, a legal change, a regulatory change, a funding request, which might be a very popular request to make one program, what would it be?
I just get one. Let's see. Funding is definitely the biggest hurdle often seen in states. Recently, APHA American Public Health Association put out a needs assessment looking at the needs of public health associations across the country, and there's 54. And one of the questions uncovered a direct inverse correlation between a decline in, or an incline in the need for more action on climate and health at the state level, with an direct inverse decline in the capacity to address it. So funding, yes, will drive capacity, staff. Oftentimes those who are working in public health departments on the climate issue aren't necessarily full-time employees focused on climate, but they may be pulled in multiple directions. So just having that pivot point, that point of contact, is really instrumental in seeing long-lasting impacts in terms of public health action in the climate space. And oftentimes we talk about health in all policies, and this is certainly an example of an issue that deserves a health in all policies approach. Health is not the end-all be-all solution or problem to the climate crisis, but certainly should be at the table with the other contributors. So I think funding to really tackle a lot of those capacity and resource issues.
Sean, as someone who has a 30,000-foot view of things, what do you think would be most helpful from the state or federal side?
I think, well, a couple things. So one is simply funding. Local governments often are strapped for funding. This type of planning is not something that most local governments have the capacity or the will to do if there isn't funding associated with it. So for example, coastal planning has benefited tremendously from grants at the state level given to local communities to do adaptation planning. So I think that's probably the number one thing. Also, just trying to coordinate efforts in a more strategic way, I think, will be especially helpful. And again, the state of California, there have been a lot of efforts to do that in the coastal context. I think it has been more complex in the wildfire context to do that, and the state is, over the last year or two, has really been working to try to figure out how to work effectively with local governments in that context as well.
And from our city representatives, Katie, what would you like to see from the state or federal level?
Well, I think even just this conversation today has been beneficial to hear what's happening in other cities. And I don't know if it's necessarily the role of state and federal government to provide this. We certainly have a lot of city to city networks that do this, but the peer-to-peer exchange of information sharing between cities, I think, is really critical for a city like LA to learn from Phoenix or San Francisco, or cities all over the country, what they're doing on heat, and Minnesota, Minneapolis. I think those sorts of peer-to-peer exchanges are incredibly useful. And anything that can be done to enhance those, make them more available. And then here in California, we do have adaptation planning grants from the state level, and I think those have been really valuable, and we need to continue with that. So I would just say kind of keep doing both of those things.
No, it's a good point. And Mark, as the quote unquote grizzled veteran that Phoenix is of these extreme heat issues, what do you think would be particularly helpful?
Yeah, I think it's really, and as kind of included in what everyone had said, is this concept, this idea of heat being something that, of our future that we're about to face, that we are starting to sort of see some of these things that it hasn't been the topic and incorporated in many of the, HUD or these other places that, have been addressing many social issues, that heat has, really not had that attention to really bring it to the forefront of what the opportunity is. I mean, it is, like I said, the more deaths from heat than all the other weather-related disasters, yet, the attention that it gets. And I think it's really important to sort of make that having cities become heat ready as part of, FEMA, as part of all these other organizations that are looking at how do we prepare our country for all our people within it to be heat ready, given the likely scenarios from the National Weather Service saying it is likely to get hotter and there will be more and more issues. And I think it really needs to raise its profile nationally.
All excellent points. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, though we've certainly covered quite a bit, and it seems there's quite a bit room for more. And I just want to thank you, everybody. Extreme heat is definitely, as you heard today, a major health and environmental issue that's already impacting cities, not just in the US, but around the world. And these are exactly the kinds of discussions we need to be having. And we will continue putting this topic front and center. So I want to thank our expert panel. I want to thank Sierra for doing a great job and fielding all these questions. And to you, our audience, you may be in a position to help plan for or otherwise address extreme heat in your community. And I encourage you to take advantage of these ideas, tips, and resources mentioned today. Sierra?
Yes, thanks all. And thank you to everyone who is attending today's session. For your future reference, the presentations from today's webinar are available on the Cool Cities event page, so we encourage you to refer back to these materials when they come up in your work. And thanks again to our fantastic panel, Cerily, Sean, Katie, and Mark. We so appreciate you lending your expertise to this event. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, you may be interested in other ELI events, which are listed on our events page at eli.org. Thanks again, and have a wonderful afternoon.